But the sermon I have here, what is growing because of the grace God gave you? On Ephesians chapter 4, verses 7 to 16, part 2. I just bought a neat book by Dr. Larry Hurtado, the late historian and Bible scholar. And the title of this book caught my attention, Destroyer of the Gods. What a great title, Destroyer of the Gods. It sounds like it could be made into a movie, probably starring Gerard Butler or Gal Gadot, Destroyer of the Gods. Dr. Hurtado said that he started out to write a book about how odd Christianity was and it seemed to the culture of the Roman Empire, how completely strange Christians appeared to their Roman countrymen. But as he followed where the research led him, as he researched and prepared for that book, he was surprised to discover how those things that once made Christianity seem so very odd to the Romans and to the Greeks, that those are now things in our Western secular culture that are taken for granted. The very things that stood out as so bizarre about Christianity, the things that Christians felt to be good and true and noble, are now those things that most Western cultures absolutely rely on and take as common sense and take for granted. That's the same thing that Tom Holland found out. I'm not referring to the Spider-Man actor, but to the historian, the writer of history books by the name Tom Holland. And that's the same thing he found out. As a boy, he was fascinated by ancient things, by dinosaurs and ancient civilizations. And so it's not a surprise that as he matured and grew up, he devoted himself to the study of ancient cultures and civilizations that are long since gone. He's not a Christian, or at least he wasn't a Christian. But as he studied, the ancient cultures of the Romans and the Greeks, and then later the Islamic cultures, he realized and he found out and he was shocked at how deeply offensive many of the things that were values embedded in those cultures, that they were offensive to him, repulsive to him, abhorrent to him. They seemed violent and alien and strange and distasteful to him. He found himself beginning to realize that the cultures he admired, the civilizations of the great ancients that he thought were once great, he now began to think of them as barbaric, strange and alien and foreign to someone who was brought up in a Western culture so permeated by the values of Judeo-Christianity. He realized that the values he holds most dear and precious, that he thinks of as civilized, are really Christian values. What was so odd about early Christianity? What so shocked the Greco-Roman culture and the people of that time about Christians was exactly what Jesus used and how Jesus Christ destroyed the old gods of the Greek and Roman civilizations. Last week, in part 2 of now 3 sermons on this passage, I said that Paul outlines 3 gifts the Lord gave to make his people one, that also prepare you and me to do our part. We saw that verse 7 in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 7, begins with good news that in Christ, grace was given to each one. You see where it says that there in verse 7. And that is, grace was given to each believer in every local church. And we took brief notice last week of the fact that verse 16 ends on that same idea by focusing on the role of each one. Grace was given to each one in verse 7, and when each one does its part in verse 16, the church functions as a whole, and it builds itself up in love. Every member of the local church doing something with the grace that God has given to every one of us in Jesus Christ. And so last week's sermon was titled, Why the Lord Gave You the Grace You Received. And today my sermon title again is, What is Growing Because of the Grace God Gave You? The reason I'm treating this as really part 2 of 3 is simply because verse 11 all the way through verse 16 is a single sentence in the Greek. It's one sentence. And so, as you remember from grade 6 grammar, that a sentence has one idea. And that's the main idea that we need to keep pursuing in this sentence from verse 11 to 16. But I couldn't do it in one sermon, or apparently in 2 sermons. It's going to take me 3 sermons to unravel Paul's central idea in verses 11 through 16. I'm not going to keep going back and reminding you of everything we've learned beforehand, but I will say that it's important that we hold the attention of verse 7. Verse 7 holds our attention and those verses as we move forward. I won't keep drawing your attention back, but you can go to our website and watch that sermon or listen to it if you missed last week. And again, next week, if you've missed this sermon today, I guess if you're watching me right now, you haven't missed this sermon today, so never mind that instruction. But next Sunday, we'll also build off of those same connections that begin back in verse 7. But the idea in verse 7 is that God in Christ gave each one of us grace. And then Paul fills out that idea some more by showing that first, the grace that is given is the sovereign gift of Jesus Christ. Second, that the grace includes specially gifted leaders, that the grace God gives to each one of us, verse 7, includes the gift of New Testament apostles and prophets, through some of whom we now have the New Testament scriptures, and then the evangelists, and lastly, the shepherds or pastors and teachers, elders in local congregations, who teach their flocks what the apostles handed down to us from Jesus Christ. And third, and probably most surprising to many of us, I think, is that Christ gave each of you to each of you. He gave the saints, equipped by the ministries of the ministers of the word, equipped to be a minister to each other in the church, in the local body, the congregation of the community of Christ. That you are to be equipped by the ministry of Bible teachers, church elders, to carry out a much greater ministry, a much wider ministry, a much more impactful ministry to one another among the people of Christ in the local church. And that means, if you are a Christian, you therefore have a mandate to do your part. And the part assigned to you is not small, it's not insignificant. In these verses, the Apostle Paul gives a vision of the people of God in a local place as a countercultural community under Christ that challenges you to radically realign everything in your life with what the Lord is doing in his church. That's the idea of this sermon. Let me say that again. In these verses, the Apostle Paul gives a vision of the people of God in a local place as a countercultural community under Christ that challenges you to radically realign everything in your life with what the Lord is doing in his church. So I have just 2 points this afternoon to show you that why the local church, the community of Christians in any place, must always be countercultural. First, we each are obligated to work for the unity of the whole. I see this in verse 12 and through the first part of verse 13. So let's look at verse 12 together. To equip the saints, and you have to understand that as the purpose or the result of the preceding instructions, the preceding verse in verse 11. He gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers, by whom we understand the elders of local churches, to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, for building up the body of Christ. Allow me to state the obvious, if you will, that the work of the ministry that Paul describes here in verse 12, the work of the ministry, it's about work. It involves some work. And if you're one of the saints, Like all the members of the church in Ephesus were called saints back at the very first verse of the whole book of Ephesians. Paul writes to the saints which are in Ephesus, the believers that are part of that church in Ephesus, the Christians who are part of that local congregation in Ephesus, and he calls them saints. And if Paul called the Ephesian Christians members of that church saints, then everybody who is a member of the Beacon Church are also saints. Every Christian, even who is an adherent of Beacon Church or an adherent or member of another church in some other place, every Christian is a saint. Someone whom Christ has made holy. That's what the word saint means, a holy one. Not holy because of who we are and how great we are, but holy because we have been selected, chosen, redeemed, saved, sanctified, and we are being matured and perfected and glorified by Jesus Christ. Saints because of him. Set apart by him for his purposes. So, the work of the ministry is your work if you are a Christian. That's what Paul says in verse 12. To equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And what ministry is that? It's work with a purpose. It's to build up the church, Paul says in verse 12. To build up the church. And Paul didn't say church here. He said body of Christ, but he means church. He means the church. Just as every saint in Ephesus was a member of the local church in Ephesus, the body is the whole unit made up of all its members. The body is a great metaphor for a local congregation. The congregation, in Greek, the ecclesia, the church, the gathered out, the collected together members of a local congregation is called the ecclesia. That's the Greek word for church. That's the body Paul's talking about here. In any given place, Ephesians 1, verse 22 to 23, makes this clear as we look back at that chapter. Ephesians 1, 22 and 23, it says, and he, that is Christ, or rather God, God, put all things under his feet, under Christ's feet, and gave him, that is Christ, as head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. So if you are a Christian, you are one of the saints in a local church, and therefore this work of the ministry belongs to you. Not to the pastors. Not to the staff that you pay to do the ministry for you. The work of the ministry in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 12 belongs to you if you are a Christian. And there is no getting away from that responsibility. For, and this is the purpose of your ministry now, what you should be aiming at, what you should be striving for, what you should be working for in your ministry under God, for the building up of the whole church, the body of Christ, verse 12. Notice that this is another idea that's found at the beginning of this passage, in the middle of this passage, and again at the end of this passage in verse 16, where it refers to each part working properly, doing its part. To what? Verse 16, to make the body grow so that it builds itself up. This is your calling as a Christian. Part of the body, a member of the body of a local church. And we're going to look more closely at what that means for each of us next week. For years after we launched Beacon Church, I prayed regularly for the church to grow in numbers. And I don't really pray that anymore. You see, in the first 3 centuries, local Christian churches were shockingly countercultural. And today, when a church makes the news, it's more likely to be just embarrassing. And yet, as we saw in the early centuries, Christian churches grew. They grew in spite of how offensive the message of Christ was to their people of their culture. The cultures of the Greeks and Romans found it hard to understand how Christians could live and think the way they did. There was a strength in churches, though, that held up as their numbers increased. There was a strength that was prepared to gather in more people without giving way to the tide of the culture, but rather holding firm. There was a strength in those local churches that remained Christian in character, even as more and more pagans came in and became Christians and joined the church. Pagans chose to become Christians. That's one thing that Tim Keller pointed out is often overlooked, is that up until Christianity, no one ever chose their religion. You were born into, it was sort of assigned to you what religion you would grow up with and live with and go along with, depending on where you were born and what your ethnic background was and so on. Christianity changed all that so that people from all kinds of backgrounds were choosing to become Christians, even when the gospel went against their cherished values. They exchanged those cherished values that they used to think, that they used to hold closely. They gave them up for the sake of embracing the gospel. The cultural beliefs of pagans over and over and over again were upset and destabilized by the weight and the resilience and the profoundly deep strength of the teachings of Jesus Christ. There was something more real people sensed in Christ and in his teaching than there was in their culture and their superstitions and their traditions and so on. The local church was like a lighthouse in the midst of the surging waves of culture's storms, but the wind and the waves were impotent against the strength of Christian conviction. Today, more often than not, when Christianity is in the news, the message that we hear, if we hear a message from that interview or whatever it is, the message sounds shrill, the convictions brittle. So the reason I don't pray for more people in the church anymore is that I'm not sure Beacon is ready to withstand those waves. I think we might just end up with too much seawater inside the church. I think it's premature to know whether Beacon Church would be a beacon or a bathtub. Whether it would, withstand and stand up against those waves and against the fury of that storm, or whether we would drown. When we think of what kind of church we want to be 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road, and we imagine and we dream of building the church and growing the church, and if we think mainly then of becoming a bigger church, of having more people, we've missed Paul's point. That's not what Paul means here by church growth. Paul means something odd and countercultural when he talks about building the church. Look at verse 13. Until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Until we all attain. You see those words? Until we all attain. Those might be words you would want to underline in your Bible. That's the growth Paul's talking about, the growth of each one of us. That word all is very important. Until we all attain. There's a destination we all need to reach. And for all of us to make it to that point will require all hands on deck. It's going to take a lot of grace to get there. All of the grace gifts that Paul already outlined beginning in verse 7. The sovereign grace from Christ. The gifted leaders of the apostles and the prophets and the evangelists and now the shepherds and the teachers. And the equipped members, each of you, to each of you. All of these gifts and grace are going to be required for the whole church to get the whole church all To this one destination, what we attain. Acts 18 verse 19, speaking of that word attain. Acts 18 verse 19 says that Paul and Priscilla and Aquila arrived in Ephesus. That was the first time Paul landed there to begin the work of planting a church, of sharing the gospel, of preaching God's word in that city of Ephesus. They arrived there, Acts 18 verse 19 says. Reaching this goal is the real aim, the finish line of the race we are running. And it is possible to attain it, to reach the goal, to get there, to arrive. In Acts 18 verse 19, the word arrive is the very same word as this word in verse 13, to attain. To arrive there, to get there, to reach the end of your journey. Just as Paul and Priscilla and Aquila arrived in Ephesus, or attained it. One day they left Corinth. They got them on board a ship at Cenchrea, where Paul incidentally got a haircut. And they sailed across the Aegean Sea, and then they arrived at the port of Ephesus. One moment they were not yet in Ephesus. They were still aboard the ship. And the next moment they were in Ephesus. They had arrived. They had attained the end of their journey. That same word in the beginning of verse 13. When you have a real destination, you can have a real arrival. You can get there. You can know when you've gotten there, when you've done it. It's a goal that you can measure when the goal is achieved. And the purpose of these gifts from Christ, of all these gifts that Paul's been talking about since verse 7, the purpose of all these gifts, when he gives sovereign grace, when God gives sovereign grace, when Jesus gives New Testament leaders and preachers and elders, when the Lord gives each and every member of the church, when equipped, the purpose is to make sure we all get there. Where? To the day when the church is united. But probably not united in the way that you might think. In 1925, a lot of Christians in Canada had the vision of uniting together, becoming a united church, and they formed the United Church of Canada, representing more at that time than 500,000 members, coming together under one banner, under the United Church of Canada. At the time, and I think still today, they might be the largest Protestant denomination in Canada. It made, though, for some very strange bedfellows. Theologically speaking, there were Presbyterians and Methodists, and right there, if you know your church history, you should gasp. There were also Congregationalists and local union churches across the prairies. In 1961, they had grown to over 1 million members, but they've been on the decline ever since, according to Wikipedia. And not just in numbers. You see, you can't have Christian unity around anything other than Christianity. Anything else isn't Christian, is it? And you can't have Christianity without Christ, can you? Can you have Christianity without Christ? The culture swamped the United Church. In that denomination, there's not much that's left that's countercultural at all about it. Look with me at verse 13. Paul is clear here about the only basis for Christian unity in verse 13. He says, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. You are each obligated to work for this unity until we all attain it. That's how long our job lasts. That's how long the mission is given to us. Until we all attain it. The unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. The United Church is no longer united by anything resembling the historic Christian faith. Their experiment with merging denominations together, I think it seemed like a good idea at the time. And it probably was led by a great deal of Christian motivation and Christian heart and Christian zeal. love for Christ in the beginning. But it hasn't ended up uniting them in the faith. Wikipedia says the policies of the church are inclusive and liberal. There are no restrictions of gender, sexual orientation, or marital status for a person considering entering the ministry. And interfaith marriages are recognized. That sets a very low bar for unity. If there is ever a picture in human society of unity, it should be between a man and wife. When the United Church marries men and women, if they do marry men and if the marriages they perform are marriages between a man and a woman, those marriages aren't even required to have a member of each being in the same faith. Interfaith marriages are recognized. If pastors and teachers are entrusted with the task of equipping the saints for the ministry of the work, to make sure all, verse 13, attain to this unity of the faith, then the vast majority of those pastors in the United Church have failed. So what does Paul mean by of the faith, the unity of the faith? It's not that we have this thing called faith. It's that we have all the same faith. This isn't about all of us having a positive spiritual attitude or some kind of non-rational confidence in something we can't prove. It's about us believing the same things. That's what he means by the faith. One faith is about our Christian faith. Like when the writer of Hebrews uses the same phrase, the faith, to describe Jesus as the author and perfecter of our faith. Hebrews 12 verse 2. Paul says the goal of all attaining this unity, the unity of the faith, also includes of the knowledge of the Son of God. So the faith has to be Christian. It has to have Jesus. Not only Jesus, a character in history, but Jesus, the divine one, the Son of God, the Most High, become incarnate. Knowledge of the Son of God. That also means something more. It means knowledge of Christ, knowing Him. When we share the same beliefs, it can't ever just be cold doctrine. We also have to know Jesus. The word here for knowledge is not the standard word to know something, like you know your phone number or you know your birthday. The word here, knowledge, has a more specialized application. It's to have come to know something, to have personally come to know something that now you know. It's not just what you were taught and passed on, like when you went to Sunday school and you were taught all the right answers, or when you heard people talk about Christianity and this before you were a Christian and you had a sort of a vague impression about what Christianity was. What you knew what Christians believed, and then one day you became a Christian and now you know. You have come to know what it means to be a Christian. You have come to know the Christian faith. And you know the Son of God. You know Him in a way that you never knew about Him before. That's what this word know means here. And that's pretty countercultural still. If Paul didn't insist that we all, verse 13, that all of us have to attain that unity, if he didn't make it so emphatic and so, narrow, that all of us have to reach this same unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, and we all had to know Him personally. This word knowledge, to know Christ in a personal, real, experiential way. If Paul didn't insist that all of us have to get to that point, well, if he allowed that each Christian could follow her own path and be encouraged to go wherever his or her self-expression leads her or them, our culture today would applaud that, wouldn't it? Our culture would celebrate that. We would probably grow as a church in numbers. Have all kinds of people saying, oh, I think I resonate with that value. But the next part of Paul's vision of the local church is even more countercultural. Even more countercultural than insisting that each one of us attain that kind of unity. The second thing we see here is that we each must be committed to spiritual maturity, both personally and corporately. I see this in the middle of verse 13 through the end of verse 14. First, Paul describes a mature man. Look with me at the middle of verse 13. To mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, so that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. A mature man, Paul says, to mature manhood. This isn't a masculine thing. That's not what this is talking about. This isn't talking about literally a man. This is a metaphor for the church as a body. The church should grow up, Paul's saying. The church has to grow up. Unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God is only attained when the church reaches that point of adulthood. A fully grown man, he calls it. And the word translated mature, it means finished, perfected, completed. Charles Hodge said, when perfect or mature is used of someone, it means an adult, one who has reached the end of his development as a human being. When applied to a Christian, it means one who has reached the end of his development as a Christian. So tell me this. When do we ever reach the end of our development as Christians? When is it okay for any of us to stop growing and stop developing and stop, growing as a Christian, much less as a human being? Paul's idea of true community is one where each of us commit to each other's ongoing change, maturing, personal transformation, personal growth and progress, unity in diversity, and mutual maturity. Unity in diversity and mutual maturity. But we're Canadian. Wouldn't it be kinder to tolerate radical individuality? Not according to the Bible. It would not be kinder. That's not a biblical value. Paul's vision for the church is one of perfect, complete, mature unity. Oneness. That's what unity means. If you want Beacon to be swamped by the waves of Victoria's culture, so that eventually the church just kind of submerges and you can't find it anymore, but what you see is Victoria, then all you need to do is hold each other loosely. Arm's length. Friendly, but not too involved, you know. You can like one another, but you can't really go so far as to love one another. If you want our church to drown, that's all you need to do. Hold each other loosely. Let everyone go their own path. I promise you then, we all will not attain our journey's end together. We need to see that in order to recover the oddness and the countercultural shock value of what it means and what it meant to be a historic Christian church, we need to start and end with the A and the Z, the Alpha and the Omega, the author and the finisher of our faith. We cannot depart from him at any point along the journey and still be Christian. Jesus is the standard for maturity that Paul envisions for every local church. He says, the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. What? Middle of verse 13. That's the goal of unity. Until we all attain the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. That's a high bar. The standard for you and me, for Christian maturity, the standard against which you measure yourself, the standard against which you compare yourself as a Christian, must be Jesus himself. You might picture this the way boys get so excited about growing taller and comparing themselves to their dads or to a full-grown man. No boy is proud of being taller than little boys. He wants to be as tall as the big boys. He wants to reach that measure of maturity, the stature, the fullness of a fully grown man. Jesus is that standard for the Christian. When it comes to your own maturity as a Christian, don't compare yourself to someone you look down on. Don't compare yourself to someone who struggles with sins that you don't relate to. Don't compare yourself to someone who is weaker than you are in some area. Don't compare yourself to someone you think is more immature. That doesn't mean you're mature. Compare your maturity to Jesus. One commentary says the goal for believers is to reach the maturity that Christ himself attained. If you think that sounds unorthodox, that commentary was published by Crossway. That should end the discussion right there. What is the fullness of Christ? Perfection. Completion. Finished. That's the fullness of Christ. That's what it means for Christ to be mature. And is that the standard then that we need to pursue and live for in Beacon Church? Perfection? Yes. Yes, it is. Clearly, we have a long way to go. But just because we have a long way to go does not mean we are failing as a church. It means we haven't finished yet. It means that day hasn't come yet. But God forgive us if we ever turn aside from the way and stop pursuing that path and stop striving for that goal to attain the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of Man, Son of God, to the stature of the fullness of Christ himself. Charles Hodge explained it well when he said that we don't have to be a perfect church in order to be a healthy church. That's my paraphrase. But to be a healthy church means to be a church that strives to reach the perfection of Jesus Christ. That's what it means to be a healthy church. He said, we are to become perfect men, by which he should mean people. We are to become perfect people. We are to attain complete conformity to Christ. And we are all to reach this high standard. The Bible, however, never represents the consummation of the church as occurring in this life. He means the goal is never reached in this life. The finish line is never crossed in this lifetime. So when do we reach that goal? When do we attain that unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God to the measure of Christ's fullness, of his stature, of his maturity? On the day of the resurrection. On the day when Jesus returns. That's our goal. That's when we will cross the line and say, I've done it. And he will say, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into your rest. When the church is represented, when the church is presented to the Lord like a bride for her bridegroom. Isn't that what Paul says just later on in the same book of Ephesians in chapter 5, verse 27, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10, when he comes on that day to be glorified in his saints and to be marveled at among all who have believed. Do you love your church like that? Where you love to see the purity and the beauty and the radiance of a church, of a bride in love with her bridegroom, in love with her Savior, devoted to him till death do us part? Is that the kind of zeal you want to see in the hearts of your fellow church members? Do you care enough to make sure that flame doesn't go out? Do you care enough? John foresaw that great and glorious wedding day. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. She was made beautiful. Revelation 21, verse 2. You see, Jesus is the reason. He's the founder, the cause of the Christian progress of the church. He is the one who, in verse 7, gives gifts to all of us, to each of us, who measures out sovereign grace to every one of us. He is also the finish line. He is the finisher. He is the final destination of the church. He is the A and he is the Z. If you're American, let me translate that. He is the A and the Z. He himself said this in Revelation 21:6. He said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega," the Greek letters for A and Z. "The Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from this spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." Revelation 21:6 and 7. And each of you are his gift to each of you to help us all attain it. What burden rests on your shoulders? What a responsibility is that? That you are entrusted with the well-being and the outcome of the final destination of your fellow church members. What a sacred privilege it is to be a Christian in a church. To be brothers and sisters with a company of brothers and sisters on the same journey to attain that day. What a wonderful, solemn obligation it is to be a follower of Jesus Christ, the Son of God who loved us and gave himself up for us. What a glory it is to follow in his footsteps, my friends. And verse 14 says we must no longer be children. So that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. I hope you catch that. Paul is implying that we, the local church, is not yet mature-ish. He is saying and implying that we are childish. But we must not be content to stay this way. Instead of being like children who dream of growing up to become firemen and doctors, we need to dream of growing up to become more like Jesus. There is no better model or example or hero to worship than Jesus. Spider-Man has nothing on Jesus. Thor has nothing on Jesus. He's got a big hammer and he can kind of fly around, but he can't walk on water or calm the storm or raise the dead. He is not the Son of God. He is not the Most High. He is, after all, fiction, not Jesus. If we lower our standards so that we can set more measurable, more achievable, more attainable goals, so that we can feel better about ourselves and the progress we're making as a society or a nonprofit organization or a club. If we choose to follow less perfect heroes, to imitate more ordinary role models, we will always remain a childish church. Immature, imperfect. And what will that mean? What will that look like? It'll look like it does now, tossed to and fro by the waves, Paul says. That's what childish means here. That's how he explains it. Tossed to and fro by the waves. Think unstable, off balance, toddlers. Except the picture here is of waves rocking a boat that is completely unable to right itself, to steady itself. It is absolutely at the mercy of the waves. And we've been tossed back and forth by some waves in 2020, haven't we? Politics, the pandemic, economic hardship, job losses, more politics. And we've been even more easily tossed to and fro, yes, because we didn't have each other to lean on in the normal ways. But it's a childish tactic to shift the blame. We are unstable and easily tossed by the waves of 2020 because we are immature. Maybe you remember how brave Peter was when he stepped out on the surface of the Sea of Galilee. And he said to Jesus, Lord, if you command me to come to you, I'll come to you. I can come to you if you command it. He had great faith in Jesus, in his word, in his power, and his sovereignty. He knew that if Jesus ordered something to be done, Peter would be able to obey the order. So Jesus did. And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus, Matthew 14:28. But then he took his eyes off of Jesus. And he became afraid of the wind and its waves. And he sank. You want to know why we have been so rocked by the events of 2020, so unsettled, so disappointed, discouraged, disheartened? We took our eyes off of Jesus. Some of us are too afraid of the virus. Some of us are too afraid of government control and overreach. But all of us have growing up to do. All of us took our eyes and regularly take our eyes off of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Children are carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes, Paul says in verse 14. We are too easily misled by wrong interpretations of the Bible, by people who misuse the Bible for their own purposes, by people who think they're wise but who don't understand the things that they're teaching. Some of those people do it deliberately to deceive. Paul calls them here deceitful schemers. Some do it out of ignorance, but that doesn't make them innocent. What he says in 1 Timothy 1 verse 6 should be a warning to us to be careful about how we choose what podcasts we listen to, what books we read, what sermons and preachers we subscribe to. He says in 1 Timothy 1:6, certain persons by swerving from these have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. It is childish Christianity to be easily influenced by fads that come and go. The gospel has never been a fad. Christianity has never been trending. All of us feel the pull of the society, of the culture. If it were up to any of us, each of us by ourselves would sink into those waves. I would. If it was not for Christ holding me, I would have been gone long ago. If it wasn't for Christ holding me today and tomorrow, I would slip under the surface of that water and drown and perish. I am not a Christian because of my conviction or my strength or my faith. I am a Christian because of Christ. And that's it. All of my faith is in Him for that reason. And you know, without your help, some of our number will not hold the line. We will not keep the faith. Some of our number will not arrive and attain the unity of that faith in that great wedding day. Christ will hold us fast, we sang at the beginning of the service. He will hold me fast. He will hold me fast. My Savior loves me, and He will hold me fast. Yes, Christ will hold us fast. But Christ has given us to each other for that purpose, to hold on to each other, to hold each other close, to keep each other close, to support and strengthen one another, to do more than just link arms in a casual gesture, but to link lives, to join with each other, to be one body, members of one one another, we'll see in the verses ahead. Christ has given each of us to each of us so that we all attain that goal. If you want to see our church lose some of its members to the waves, just hold each other loosely. Just know each other to greet each other on Sundays. Don't worry about getting to know the names of everybody in the church. Don't worry about inviting people over for meals after the pandemic. Just wave and say, oh yeah, I think I go to church with that person. Say a casual prayer now and again for the church in general. Hold each other loosely if you want to see it fail. Or you could hold each other tightly and securely until we all attain that unity. Mature unity, the maturity of Christ Himself. The stature of the fullness of Christ. Each of us, my friends, is obligated. Each of us to whom grace has been given in verse 7, each of us is obligated to do verse 12, to do the work of the ministry for the sake of the building up of the church until we attain that unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. Each of us towards spiritual maturity for ourselves and for the whole congregation. We have a shared mutual responsibility and obligation. And before we're ready for our church to get bigger, we need to pray that God will make our church stronger, healthier. And Paul's vision for how that's going to radically transform all of our relationships in the church, all of our priorities in the church, is the subject of next week's sermon. In the meantime, I encourage you to join us in prayer as we begin to pray like we have never done before, to pray for our church, to pray for our city, to pray for the progress of the gospel of Jesus Christ among us. Will you join us in this? Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this great, great passage of Scripture that gives us such a lofty goal, such a great vision of what it means to be a community of saints in a local place. We ask for your forgiveness for all of the ways in which we have lost that vision and lived our lives unto ourselves and not taken a serious and committed sense of responsibility for each other. But Lord, now would you forgive us for that and cause us to keep on bearing fruit in keeping with this repentance. That, Lord, you would lead us and guide us and grow us and strengthen us by your Holy Spirit, by this word of Scripture, penetrating our minds, affecting our consciences, changing our behaviors, so that we grow up. we ask that you would make us stronger, Lord, as a church. We ask that you would make this church, Beacon Church, more and more in the years ahead, show and resemble Christ. That you would let our church become known for a bizarre, odd, countercultural love. A love that holds each other fast, that will not let each other go, that cares for each other through hard times and good times, that preserves, that doesn't seek its own interest, that it keeps no record of wrongs, that always forgives, that always perseveres, that always believes. Would you make us a church like that, Lord Jesus, I pray. In your name, amen.